HMS Ganges, the shore training establishment for boys, first opened its gates in October of 1905 and closed for the last time in June 1976. For discipline, its reputation was legendary, and to this day, there are many who still believe it was staffed by some of the most sadistic petty officers to be found in the Royal Navy. Certainly, the rigorous hardships experienced during those many months of training helped to mold character and self-discipline, which was, of course, the exact requirements of their lordships at the Admiralty. Boat drill and sailing were also part of the Ganges curriculum, and this went on all year round, regardless of heavy rain, snow, or even a howling gale. Typically in the 1930s, about once a month, an old S-class destroyer would arrive from Chatham, anchoring off shortly for a week, affording classes the opportunity of daily trips out to sea. On completion of course, if the entrant had been given a Chatham designation, they were usually drafted via the destroyer, such as the Scimitar, as seen here, on its return voyage to the Medway. The reputation of Ganges was always enhanced by the infamous mast, the climbing of which was compulsory to the half-moon level at some 130 feet, but beyond that it was voluntary. The button boy, who stood on the small circular top platform, would always receive a payment of 1 shilling for his heroic endeavor. On entering the mainstream of naval service, all the customs and discipline codes experienced at Ganges would still be found waiting for them. From barracks to battleships, those awesome figures of GIs, the Master-at-Arms, the dreaded regulating branch, would still be part of their daily lives. Although during my own service I never experienced HMS Excellent, the Royal Navy's gunnery school in Whale Island, I well remember the buzz I used to hear when attached close by at HMS Mercury that it was a place almost akin to the gates of hell. Perhaps in retrospect, much of that was all a youthful exaggeration, though I'm sure there are many who would disagree. At the outbreak of the war, the ranks of the Navy were rapidly swelled by large numbers of conscripts. Being that their naval service would only be for the war's duration, they were known as HOs, hostilities only. For many of these men, the sudden change in lifestyles was psychologically dramatic, for the Royal Navy was not going to lower its standards of discipline purely out of sympathy. And after just a few short weeks of basic training, they could find themselves experiencing the horrors of the Pentland Firth or the storm-tossed seas far out in the Atlantic. Many could not even swim. After hours of square bashing, stand easy was always a welcome break. Double here, double there, commanders, defaulters, and request men, number 11s, the sudden exposure to it all seemed so bewildering and hectic. Those curt staccato calls over the tannoy. Dear here there, men under punishment and stoppage of leave to muster. Cooks to the galley, up spirits, hands to dinner, out pipes, clear lower decks, liberty men fall in, pipe down. It was a life unique to all of us that experienced it. And perhaps years later, in reflection, we are proud of it. And so incredibly, after just a few short weeks of bullying petty officers hurling their commands on the parade ground, the HOs took on the appearance of smart discipline ratings. Then it was off to their individual depots for a draft ship, and the luck of this draw determined by fate whether you were to live or die.
Draft, Stennet E. Now, when I call out your names, I shall also call out your locker number, all right? Now you'll go and fetch your gear and take it to your lockers. Draft, attention. Left turn, double march.
Come on into the banner room, I said. Now come on, jump to it, all of you. Now hurry up, those men. Come on now, hurry up. What are you waiting for? Do it, all of it.
Very early in the war, the threat of the German magnetic mine had to be quickly mastered to prevent complete closure of many of Britain's main ports and bases. Already the Nelson had been seriously damaged, while the new cruiser HMS Belfast had her back broken, which kept her inactive for 3 years. The destroyer Blanche had been sunk in the Thames estuary, and a second destroyer, the Gypsy, seen here, was mined off Harwich with the loss of 1 officer and 30 ratings. Also mined were numerous East Coast merchant vessels. Intensive minesweeping became paramount, and the following Admiralty message was broadcast.
The Admiralty needs a large number of fishermen, especially enginemen and stokers, to form the crews of additional mine-sweeping and anti-submarine vessels. The age limits are 18 and 45, and volunteers should, if possible, have had not less than 1 year's experience in deep-sea fishing vessel, but men with a satisfactory general experience may also be accepted. Application should be made to the nearest registrar, Royal Naval Reserve, who will be found at the Mercantile Marine Office or Customs House.
Minesweeping was a very precarious operation, and many fatal casualties occurred due to the enormity of the explosion when one was triggered inadvertently. By the end of 1940 alone, over 100 of these converted trawlers had been lost, mostly by mine and others by enemy aircraft. Yet by the second year of the war, the Navy had almost 1,000 minesweepers in service, and even this figure will greatly increase during the succeeding war years. There were three basic types of mines to contend with: contact, acoustic, and magnetic, and various techniques were employed in countermeasures. Even to this day, mining and countermining still constitutes an almost invisible, ceaseless war, as the ingenuity of science presses ever forward in the dubious art form of sinister death-dealing technology. Through the media, most people are given the false illusion that once a mine appears on the surface, its successful destruction always culminates in a huge explosion after being hit by gunfire. In reality, this is to be avoided, for such an explosion would have everyone diving for cover, and the ship itself could be in danger. The object is to avoid hitting the contact horns and sink it gently by means of bullet holes into the casement. The sweeping method employed here is using an oar piece of float, a paravane-type device used in conjunction with a submerged kite, which trailed from the stern a long wire with a cutting edge. Hopefully, this would release a mine suspended from the seabed, and in this particular case, again, the undesired surface explosion is portrayed by means of gunfire. During the war, there was a large amount of coastal trade from the Firth of Forth to the Thames and along the south coast as far as Plymouth, all of which was vulnerable to attack by enemy surface vessels, submarines, and aircraft, even heavy guns located on the French Channel coast. And as will be disclosed in this following rare film sequence, convoys were all coordinated from inside the Admiralty.
20,000 tons of coal to be delivered from Dover to Falmouth, steel and machinery to Portsmouth and Southampton, and general cargo to Plymouth.
We should have 10 ships available before Saturday, sir.
How they are? Lewis guns, sir, and the Greyfriars has a 12-pounder. They'll have to go in convoy. Those dive bombers have been very active in the Channel lately. Destroyers will be a godsend just now. Well, we'll have to order the convoy to assemble at Southend. 10 ships, sailing in the morning tide. Understand?
Yeah.
I'll leave it to you.
Aye, sir.
The nerve center of all naval control was the underground communication room at the Admiralty, from which all convoy formation instructions would be sent to the applicable escorts and merchant ships. Being an ex-telegraphist myself, who joined when living in the London area, one's mind is intrigued at the thought of having been given such a draft assignment.
Come in.
Signal, sir.
My God, I'll say that order as soon as I get busy. Mr. Mate, we're sailing in convoy on the morning tide. Get part of the forecastle there and put your windlass in gear. Stand by to heave away. Gunner, I hope your guns followed all in good order. That 12-pounder aft, clean and in good condition. Aye, sir. Heave away, Mr. Mate.
The ideal escort for these coastal convoys was the Hunt-class destroyer. Its initial design was born out of the realization that in the likely event of a forthcoming war with Germany, the Royal Navy would be faced with an acute shortage of destroyers, and the Hunt-class, being smaller and less heavily armed than a fleet destroyer, could be produced more quickly and in large numbers. Typically, some used exclusively on East Coast convoys mounted a single bow chaser pom-pom. Some never even left home waters throughout the war, but many were allocated the role of a fleet destroyer and did serve in far-off distant waters. Scattered here and there in the archives, I found only a few short film clips of these handsome destroyers, which I have endeavored to piece together. So without dialogue, let us enjoy these few rare brief scenes from the past.
Hello, forward. Get on that rope. That's a double. Thank you. That's a double. Let go off.
All in for leaving harbour.
Being shepherd to slow-moving merchant stragglers in convoy was not every destroyer captain's dream of command, but nevertheless, early in the war, even some of the new J&K class destroyers were allocated this role. Early in the morning, it was the procedure of RM warships to close up for dawn action stations, though what now follows will be more in keeping with just typical scenes of call in the hands.
Shower, get your feet on the deck. Straight into the showers. Waking. Shower, get your feet on the deck. Last one out. Waking. Waking. Straight into the showers.
Be they fleet or escort destroyers, one thing they did share in common was exceedingly crowded mess decks where the crews lived, ate and slept, and out of interest, breakfast was a non-event. With excessive wartime complements, there was frequently not enough available spaces to sling your hammock. Thus, some crew members had to make do by sleeping on just table or locker tops, and in rough weather, certainly not recommended. Also, being located up in the forecastle, conditions were frequently very wet and cold, or conversely, in the tropics, extremely hot and humid. "Roll on my 12" was a frequently heard exclamation. A signal is passed from the escort leader to the convoy commodore to alert all ships to the possibility of an enemy attack. Meanwhile, below deck, some crew members are enjoying a few moments of relaxation. Similar events were also about to occur on board the coastal steamers, where some crew members could also be found relaxing in a game of cards or dining in the mess. Being so slow and lightly armed, their plight was more vulnerable than that of the escorts.
So I said to my missus, I said to her, your idea of a convoy is dozens of destroyers tearing up and down on each side of us. Oh, but the whole thing. One destroyer, 2 load guns, crafting guards, and keep your powder dry. Them's my sentiment. You said it, mister. You just about said it. I got us a jerry. Enemy flying, sir! Action station!
From coastal convoys, we now turn to an event which took place off the west coast of Africa in September of 1940, Operation Menace. The definitive details of this affair are beyond the scope of this particular program. All I am attempting to do is present what surviving archive film remains of this operation. The force comprised of the Barham, which is the Canberra ship, Resolution and Ark Royal, the cruisers Australia, Devonshire and Cumberland, transports and destroyers, one of which, the Foresight, can be seen here closing the Barham. This destroyer was lost some 2 years later in the Mediterranean. The Barham had just recently sailed from Scapa Flow, and after this operation, she too was destined for those same very familiar peacetime waters, which was all to end in tragic, appalling circumstances. In its briefest form, Operation Menace was an attempt, which failed, to neutralize the French colonial port of Dakar, for at the time it was believed there was a possibility of its use by German surface raiders and submarines. In hindsight, we now know this never occurred. Here a patrolling flight of swordfish can be seen taken off from Ark Royal, and fortunately, one carried a movie camera which affords us a unique overhead view of this task force. Simultaneously, these same aircraft were also being filmed from the Barham. When the task force arrived off Dakar on the morning of the 23rd, the entire area was found to be shrouded in a veil of mist. A Free French force under General de Gaulle made contact with the Vichy inhabitants, and as the British force remained offshore, he attempted to gain a peaceful settlement. In observing some of the other warships present, which were captured on film, the destroyer with the black leader band is probably the Falkner, as observed by the captain of the Barham.
Drink out battle ensign. Tyson.
This county-class cruiser must be the Australia, while further in the distance is to be seen the Devonshire. By late afternoon, negotiations had broken down, and under threat of a forced landing, the Vichy French showed their hostile displeasure by opening fire with shore batteries and the guns of the battleship Richelieu, which was berthed in the harbor. bomb had sustained minor damage to her forecastle during the action, which continued into the following day. But more alarmingly, on the third day, the Resolution was torpedoed by a French submarine. Taking many factors into consideration, not least the plight of Resolution, with her reduced speed and a 12-degree list of port, it was decided to abort the operation and withdraw all forces to Freetown. This voyage was badly handicapped by the serious damage to the battleship, and the next day, after limping along at only 5 knots, the old Resolution finally came to a stop. With her forward boiler room flooded and serious problems with the main machinery lubrication system, it was then decided that the Barham would have to take her in tow.
Do you hear there? Do you hear there? Second part of starboard watch, report to the quarterdeck.
For reasons unknown to myself, at some point of the operation while stopped, the Barham sent one of her seaboats over to the cruiser Devonshire. The attendant destroyer would appear to be the Escapade. Somehow, through the magic of film, the Barham's cutter had transformed into a whaler. What is noticeable was the frequent use of the old Sun pith helmet, known affectionately in the Navy as a topi. By popular demand, the Admiralty finally phased it out of service around 1942. The sequel to these events for the Resolution were, after temporary repairs at Freetown, she returned briefly to the UK and then sailed to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, spending some 6 months repairing major damage and a complete refit, after which she subsequently joined a very fragile East Indies fleet. But the future for poor Barham, upon her return to the Mediterranean, would be devastating. Another warship which was to also operate in the Mediterranean during 1940 was the cruiser Kent. And what you're about to see is some extremely rare private film taken by its first lieutenant, or Jimmy the One, with his own 16mm Bell & Howell camera. The cruiser had recommissioned at Chatham in May of 1938 and eventually arrived in Hong Kong early September to begin her long commission as flagship on the China Station. These next few immediate scenes are perhaps representative of some of the typical onboard activities when at sea. Of interest, among the ship's company were a number of boy ratings who had joined from HMS Ganges. A full shoot exercise is planned, and the ship's walrus, about to be catapulted, will tow a target drone for use of the short-range weapons. After the exercise, the Walrus returns, still intact. Certainly not an elegant aircraft by any standards, but nevertheless, it was extremely rugged and reliable, being affectionately known in the Navy as the Shagbat. Though perhaps not generally known, she was designed by the same R.J. Mitchell of the legendary Spitfire fame. Hoisting it back on board was not the easiest of tasks, especially for the observer. Observed from the port side of Kent is the new cruiser Birmingham. She too was serving on the China station. This county-class cruiser is believed to be the Australia. H-53 was the ill-fated destroyer HMS Dainty. The D-class were used extensively on the pre-war China station, but during the war, their numbers were severely decimated. The depot ship for the 4th Submarine Flotilla based at Hong Kong was HMS Medway, and two further counter-class cruisers serving on the China station during this period were the ill-fated HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, both being sunk together by Japanese aircraft in April of 1942 when some 300 miles south of Colombo. In Hong Kong, Captain Ashmore is about to be piped ashore.
What's ready? Mike.
To be seen berthed in the harbour, adjacent to what appears to be the old China Fleet Club, is a rear view of the destroyer Tinnitus, decked out for mine laying. She was one of the 4 destroyers which sailed from Singapore on that fatal voyage of the Prince of Wales and Repulse. Later, she would also be sunk by a Japanese aircraft in April of 1942. These are scenes of the Fleet Regatta, which was held in the spring of 1939, and as always, such events were looked upon with great importance by the different ships companies involved, for a lot of pride was at stake. Again, in the background, there appears the white building of the legendary Old China Fleet Club, which was in more recent times rebuilt. Being flagship, the participating cruiser Kent were automatically put under greater pressure to achieve the best winning results. And to help ensure this, the first lieutenant devised what he called his patented dry puller, which enabled the crews to put in a maximum training program. All this extra effort paid off handsomely, for when the results board was posted, Commander Blundell must have been extremely satisfied to see the Kent topping the list, followed by the Birmingham, Dorsetshire, Eagle, Medway, and Cornwall. And on board, the trophies represented by the C&C, who was Admiral Sir Percy Noble. This is the Medway filmed at Singapore on November 20th, 1939. She was the first large submarine depot ship built for the Navy and was sunk by a U-boat off Alexandria in June 1942. The Kent is actually underway leaving Singapore, probably for the very last time, for she was bound for Colombo after exchanging commissions with the cruiser Liverpool, seen here in the Admiralty floating dry dock. Pictured on the right must be the old 4-funnel Australian cruiser Adelaide. It is interesting to contrast this view of the Liverpool with that of her filmed also by Commander Blundell in Alexandra Harbour some 11 months later. Hit by a torpedo from an Italian aircraft, she subsequently lost her bow and was towed into harbour by the cruiser Orion. This damage was eventually repaired at Mare Island, San Francisco, and by an ironic twist of fate, after returning to home waters in December of 1941, where she engaged in some Russian convoy escort duties, she was again torpedoed in the Mediterranean by Italian aircraft in June of 1942, and this was to keep her out of active service at Rosyth for the rest of the war. With the battleship Ramillies, the Kent was part of an escort for the first Anzac troop convoy which sailed from Fremantle in January of 1940. Some of the troop ships comprised of the Empress of Canada and Japan, Orion, Okkades, Dunera, and the Rangitata, though not necessarily all seen here or in that order. Her last Anzac troop convoy assignment took place in May, and at some point of time in the Indian Ocean, she caught a rare glimpse of the Queen Mary sailing alone at some 25 knots. The following month, HMS Kent joined the 3rd Cruiser Squadron in the Mediterranean. She would never again return to the waters of the Far East. The carrier Eagle was also one of a number of warships which had been transferred from the Far East to reinforce Admiral Cunningham in the Mediterranean, whose flagship, as seen here, was HMS Warspite. Again, another view of the cruiser Liverpool, for she too had joined the same theater of operations, of which the battleship Malaya was also a member. It's a paradox, for in viewing these handsome, magnificent warships from the past, one can only reflect with a touch of sadness that the quality of some of yesteryear's 16mm film could at times leave so much to be desired, whereas with today's technology, making easily available color video cameras, our seas are now bereft of these classic-looking warships, the likes of which the world will never see again. To my knowledge, these are probably the only close-up views taken of the Eagle at sea during wartime, and by coincidence, Commander Blundell was to actually film in color her sinking 2 years later during Operation Pedestal. Joining this same force from home waters is the ill-fated cruiser Coventry. Badly hit by Ju-87s in September 1942, she had to be abandoned with the loss of 63 officers and ratings, and then she was sunk by the destroyer Zulu. During the previous month, the Coventry had been preceded by the leader of the 14th Flotilla, HMS Jervis, and as she came alongside the Kent, she was eagerly devoured by the camera, being of a new class of destroyer which had previously been unseen by the pre-war personnel of the China Station. The Jervis was a sister ship of HMS Kelly, for both had been built simultaneously at Hawthorne Leslie's on the Tyne. In her complement were 16 boy ratings, though fortunately, Jervis was a lucky ship and survived the entire war without sustaining one fatal casualty.
Okay, what was that? Yeah, okay. Right, what's the watch?
The carrier Illustrious was another new arrival in the Eastern Mediterranean, having sailed from Scapa Flow in August of 1940 and only 3 months later achieved lasting fame for her attack on the Italian fleet base of Taranto. These are short film clips I have found showing various destroyers of the 10th and 14th flotillas at Alexandria during this period. Some of the 10th contained a number of old V&W class destroyers, which were manned by Australian crews, who affectionately named them the Scrap Iron Flotilla. This is a tribal class F-36 HMS Nubian, and it is followed by an all but too brief view of the Australian destroyer Vampire. H-53 is again the Dainty. She would be sunk by aircraft off Tobruk in February of the following year with the loss of 2 officers and 12 ratings. And once more we see the ill-fated Vampire as she closes alongside a tanker. The cruiser Gloucester arrived at Alexandria in May, joining the 7th Cruiser Squadron. Exactly 1 year later, she would be sunk off Crete with only 82 survivors. The Barham arrived in November, and by a strange coincidence, she too would be sunk exactly 1 year later. Tragically, with so much original film footage being so savagely edited and abused many years ago, the length of the surviving archive sequences frequently make it difficult to try and compose just a few short necessary words to now fit this fixed related time scale of the visual image. However, here we are given the luxury of a longer than usual surviving sequence showing Admiral Cunningham on the quarterdeck of his beloved warspite. Through his legendary exploits in the Mediterranean, the nation was probably more aware of his name than that of any other British admiral of World War II. The now historically famous Australian cruiser Perth, berthed at Alexandria, is about to be visited by Prime Minister Menzies and Admiral Cunningham. Together with the American cruiser Houston, the Perth would be sunk off Java after being overwhelmed by a large Japanese naval force in March 1942. Of her complement of 680, barely 200 survivors would eventually return to Australia. Once again, with only fragmentary surviving archive film, I have endeavored to piece together an event which almost certainly was filmed in August of 1940, when the warspite led the fleet out of Alexandria to bombard Bardier. This must be the Malaya, with the cameraman being on board the Ramillies. And if you look closely, you will shortly catch a brief glimpse of the Australian destroyers Vendetta and the ill-fated Waterhand. Then you will see Diamond, H-22. She was sunk only 8 months later, reportedly with no survivors. A simple naval draft ship could be an awful luck of the draw. Certainly the cruiser Kent took part in this operation, but simply because I could find no other way of using them, I have taken the liberty of inserting, purely for visual display, some existing rare short views filmed in the Mediterranean of the luckless destroyers Kingston and Hereward, followed by the Perth, and in dazzle pattern, possibly the Orion.
We're 163.
On the return voyage to Alexandria, the fleet was bombed by high-level Italian aircraft, though on this occasion no real damage was sustained.
Aircraft inside astern, sir.
At 1600 hours on the 24th of November, 1941, Admiral Cunningham and the fleet set sail from Alexandria. For HMS Barham, it would be her last voyage. And here we are faced with another paradox. For although these are definitely stern views of the Barham filmed in the Mediterranean, and though we know her final moments were filmed from the Valiant, there appears to be no footage of that actual fatal voyage other than the calamitous end itself. Yet it would seem inconceivable that the camera was not used at any other time during this operation. And to me, this does remain a tantalizing mystery. What you are seeing here are just some brief items I have inserted of the Eastern Mediterranean fleet taken during this particular period of the war. However, on the afternoon of the next day, early into the first dog watch, the U-331 at periscope depth slipped in between two of the destroyer escorts, the Jervis and Griffin, and hit the Barham with 3 torpedoes. As she rapidly heeled to port, already telltale wisps of deadly white smoke can be seen near the mainmast and the point of the eventual catastrophic explosion. Ironically, though the Jervis had made an echo contact, it was decided to ignore it as being just an ASDIC non-sub. Cunningham would be furious. But for the crew members of Barham, who were trapped below decks, conditions by now must have been absolutely appalling as they desperately tried to fight their way topside, and the lights were rapidly going out. The number of lives lost on HMS Barham is put at somewhere around 880 officers and ratings, of whom some were just mere boys. The Admiralty stated there were 396 survivors, yet strangely, the tally of the rescue and destroyers numbered about 50 less. However, one thing is certain, it is the most horrific ending of a ship that was ever captured on film. Rest in peace, Barham.